What will Putin do when hundreds of long-range missiles simultaneously fire into Russian territory? And will ATACMS be able to penetrate his bunker? Is Russian blackmail no longer effective, or is this a deliberate raising of the stakes ahead of likely negotiations? We'll talk about that with Israeli military analyst David Sharp. David, hello. My deepest condolences to the Ukrainians for the loss of life in Odesa and Sumy. Thank you for your words of support. So far, there have been 10 dead and 43 injured. This is an eloquent illustration of the effect of the phone calls by Scholz and others willing to negotiate with Putin. The only language our neighbor understands is force. I believe I'll soon see them strike Russian airfields, though I'd also like to see the Kremlin hit. Friends, we are broadcasting live, so be sure to write your comments, give us a like, and of course, don't forget to indicate from which country and city you are watching us. Dmitry Peskov spoke, though of course no one asked him to. But he did comment on the Kursk decision, saying that the West's authorization to use long-range weapons to strike deep inside Russia was a new round of tensions. Where are the nuclear weapons? Where are all those red lines? And why haven't the missiles hit the Western countries as they promised earlier? And they didn't explicitly promise to strike with nukes or conventional missiles, because any strike on Western countries is a war, a big war between Russia and NATO. At the same time, such a war is not only unnecessary for Russia, but could be disastrous for it. Russia is far inferior to NATO in conventional arms and, of course, weaker in the nuclear sphere. However, nuclear war is absolutely unacceptable for any minimally sane leader. Even for those who are close to losing their sanity, it remains off limits. This is why we see a cautious American policy in terms of authorizations for Ukraine and arms deliveries. Russia is bluffing in many ways, intimidating the West with its possible responses. Admittedly, this bluffing strategy works to some extent. For example, Western countries have often postponed the delivery of certain weapon systems. We remember the long epics with the transfer of tanks and other weapons, as well as disputes over authorizations to use them for strikes on Russian territory. Let us recall the case of the RDK raid in the Belgorod region, when the fighters were seen carrying Belgian automatic rifles. Then even the Belgian Foreign Ministry tried to find out officially how such weapons ended up on Russian territory without authorization. All this is the result of Russia's policy of intimidation, including nuclear blackmail. However, intimidation does not mean that Russia is really ready to use nuclear weapons or start a war with NATO. Russia has less dangerous tools: sabotage of NATO countries, cyber attacks, information campaigns, and arms transfers to rogue states or terrorist groups.
Кибератаки, естественно, информационные атаки и передача тех или иных вооружений странам-изгоям или даже террористам.
One such step could have been to provide weapons to the Yemeni Houthis, such as Yakhont anti-ship missiles and Bastion systems, to complicate global shipping and damage the United States. But Russia refrained from doing so because of the risk of spoiling relations with Saudi Arabia, which is important to it.
Того оружия, которого у них нет, и которое позволило бы хуситам создать дополнительные проблемы мировому судоходству и конкретно американцам, в частности...
Thus, for the most part, Russia is using a bluff to intimidate the West. This does not exclude the ability to take individual actions that might actually alarm its opponents.
Воздержалась от этого шага, так как саудовцы важны. В общем, блеф в большинстве своем, в части случаев, способность пойти на те или иные шаги, которые так и в самом деле припугивают Запад, Это то, на что Россия вполне способна, то, что она делала до сих пор, и нет
But a
причин
war with
считать,
NATO
чтобы она
is
не
not the kind of
продолжила
sheepskin
действовать
that is
подобным
worth it
образом
for
дальше.
Russia.
А вот слова о втягивании НАТО, о новом витке, по большому счету это слова, потому что каждая страна...
Nevertheless, words are worthless, and if they have had an impact so far, why not keep saying them, reinforced by small steps in hybrid warfare?
Не та овчинка, которая стоит для России выделки, однако слова денег не стоят, и как мы видим, кое на что эти слова до сих пор влияли, почему бы их не произносить снова, тем более подкрепляя разного рода мелкими делами, наподобие гибридной войны.
On the subject of the Houthis, The Economist is now writing, noting that the Russian Federation could expand its support for the Houthis and intensify sabotage in response to Western weapons strikes. So far, however, we have seen their first cynical response, terrorist strikes in Ukraine. Odesa, Sumy. We remember, of course, with deep sympathy all the victims, express our support for their families, and wish the injured a speedy recovery. Meanwhile, we see that these strikes are intensifying. We are talking not only about attempts to exert psychological pressure on the Ukrainian authorities, but also on the entire population of Ukraine. The people of Kiev, as well as the people of many other cities, have been kept awake at night for a whole week now. And this has been happening time after time. This is clearly part of a strategy where drones are used not only as a means of wearing down Ukrainian air defense and causing material damage, but also as a powerful psychological weapon.
Надавить психологически на украинскую власть и на все население Украины. То, что киевлянам не дают спать, и не только киевлянам, а жителям очень многих городов не дают спать почти каждую ночь на протяжении целой недели, и так раз за разом, это очевидно часть стратегии, когда беспилотники здесь играют роль и психологического оружия, не только оружие, которое должно измотать украинское ПВО, нанести конкретно материальный ущерб, речь идет об этом.
When it comes to the upcoming negotiations, it is clear that the Kremlin's attempt to conduct them from a position of strength looks quite logical to them. In their understanding, a position of strength means maximum pressure on the front, despite losses, in order to achieve advancement, as well as pressure on literally every Ukrainian, thanks to the very long arm that they have developed. Here we are seeing these strikes on a daily basis, and then a very powerful combined strike by various types of missiles and drones. As we head into winter, the energy impact becomes one of what they consider to be significant leverage. Incidentally, they refrained from using this leverage last winter, probably fearing the unfreezing of a hung congressional bailout package in America. In general, this could be an incentive for the West to increase aid to Ukraine. Last winter, they refrained from using this lever to hit Ukraine's energy sector. Today, however, they believe that Biden and his administration will have time to provide Ukraine with exactly as much aid as possible before Trump's cadence begins. Therefore, in their opinion, it is now worth maximizing pressure on the Ukrainians on all fronts. That's the way I see it, and apparently such actions will continue. It's hard to imagine that they would launch one such strike and then refrain, just as it's hard to imagine that the last few weeks have been a preparation for a sudden cessation of attacks. I completely agree. These strikes are a deliberate strategy. Russia's goal is to destroy Ukraine, and they started that a long time ago and are continuing it now, despite the fact that we are not attacking but defending. The State Duma speaker said Russia could respond to Western long-range missiles with unused weapons in Ukraine. Which systems could that be? It's hard for me to even speculate at first glance basically what it could be if we consider nuclear weapons. But nuclear war is totally inadequate.
это абсолютный неадекват. Во-первых, это и близко, я даже говорю, ни по российской военной доктрине, ни по здравому.
First of all, this is by no means the occasion or reason for the use of nuclear weapons as prescribed in Russian military doctrine and common sense. The use of nuclear weapons for Russia would lead to catastrophic consequences in all respects. I am not talking about the fact that it will cause a reaction of the world and the US, and not only that, but also the reaction of Russia's partners. By the way, the use of nuclear weapons could also trigger a response from Ukraine. When a country is pressed against the wall, one should not expect a calm reaction. When Russia's nuclear facilities are in the kill zone, those considering nuclear weapons must factor in potential missile strikes or sabotage. Nuclear weapons are illogical and inadequate. As for conventional weapons, it's hard to imagine anything not already in use for military or terror purposes.
Что-то, от чего воздерживались, что что-то было бы целесообразно с военной точки зрения или с точки зрения терроризирования.
There's not much stopping them. They avoid certain targets, but I won't elaborate to avoid political implications. As for specific weapons, I can't imagine what they'd use. Putin has said strikes like that would mean NATO countries directly joining the war against Russia.
Разного рода политические и стратегические соображения, а вот конкретной системы вооружения мне даже в голову не приходит.
Все-таки, если говорить еще о том, как...
They have even been changing their nuclear doctrine. Moscow has also said that it will respond with a military response. But even if that doesn't happen, the issue of negotiations will be much more difficult. The escalation level continues to rise, and now it will be harder to negotiate with Russia to end the war.
Но даже вот если это не произойдет, то теперь, в принципе, по поводу переговоров, тут будет теперь сложнее как-то договариваться с Россией там об окончании войны, поскольку...
Or, on the contrary, is this raising the stakes to force Russia to negotiate?
Повышение ставок для того, чтобы как раз принудить Россию к этим переговорам.
This rate increase is cautious due to the limited missile range and the geography of the Kursk region, although it may expand, and there are limits on the targets allowed. For example, I am almost 100% sure that wherever the geography has been expanded, the Americans have not given permission and are not going to give it, at least under the current administration. And we have no idea what will happen under the next administration, for better or for worse. At the moment, for example, for strikes on Russia's fuel and energy complexes, or on the same power plants, of course, there is no authorization. If such authorization were in place, it could deter Russia from striking deep into Ukraine, as it might risk retaliation. This is speculative, but shows how authorizations can create opportunities for restrictions, agreements, and flexibility in negotiations. It's not just about permission leading to more attacks on Russian targets. Although this is also some factor, if Russia has conditions, I don't know, within Russia, or as Putin sees it, or pressure from the United States, but if they have a situation where it is in their interest to negotiate with some results, the presence or absence of authorization to strike Russian territory will not affect. That is, if there is a deep interest, for example, to compromise, or, on the contrary, to refuse all compromises, it will be so. It's not a factor significant enough to strategically change decisions about negotiations, much less the willingness to end the war. This is a super-strategic, epochal decision. It takes more significant factors to affect it, although these factors are made up of many smaller elements. And CNN called Biden's likely decision to give Ukraine the right to strike Russia with long-range missiles quite provocative. and, according to journalists, it will complicate Trump's position in his attempts to make peace.
Телеканал CNN назвал довольно провокационным вероятное решение Байдена дать Украине право бить дальнобойными ракетами по России. По мнению журналистов, оно усложнит положение Трампа.
Now, President-elect Donald Trump may think he can talk peace, but he will inherit a war in which the stakes have only gotten much higher. And on the other hand, I'm here thinking that Trump met with Biden recently. Perhaps this is just Trump's agreement, and Biden is willing to give us this authorization to elevate Ukraine's position in the next negotiations, well, so that we're plus or minus equal. In theory, Biden may or may not have informed Trump of the decision. Moreover, I will purely from my own point of view suggest that, let's say, Trump's permission, I'm pretty sure he certainly didn't ask for it. He felt that he should act as he saw fit. He didn't feel it was necessary. The quotes from journalists about the provocative decision, that this in some way complicates Trump's position, can only raise a smile. If Trump intends to take some steps, and firmly intends, I don't mean what kind of steps, but of a strategic scale, aimed at ending the war or vice versa, related to some kind of assistance to Ukraine, then this authorization by Biden will make almost no difference. Trump, first of all, can start from scratch. Secondly, claim it's not his decision and then easily accept it. In any case, it is not so serious a strategic move that it would present obstacles. The obstacles would be of an entirely different nature. For example, if some proposal Trump does not make to Putin, and Putin finds it unacceptable, Putin, as experience has shown, can simply not accept the proposal and actually let Trump understand, do what you want, we don't accept it, rewrite it. So it's all very conditional. Certainly Biden decided to do what a lot of people demanded of him, under pressure that has been very intense in recent months. The occasion was North Korean troops engaging in hostilities on the side of Russia, which seemed serious enough. After all, when the Americans did not give Ukraine certain authorizations or deliver weapon systems, the main element of the strategy was the fear of escalation with Russia, or that Russia would hand over weapons to someone. For example, the Houthis. Another part of this strategy was that the U.S. could tell Russia, through behind-the-scenes channels, that if it accepted, say, missiles from Iran or took some far-reaching steps, then the U.S. could authorize Ukraine to strike Russian territory. So say, refrain. Maybe it sometimes worked, maybe Russia sometimes refrained. But in general, as we can see, Russia did not refrain from accepting North Korean aid, or from supplying ballistic missiles from Iran. And perhaps when the Americans see that the threat of handing over something or authorizing something has not worked, they have to at least partially carry out the threat. Otherwise, they will lose that deterrent. Otherwise, their threats will no longer be taken seriously. Then there's the election factor, of course. Before the elections, any step that could even theoretically hinder them was naturally not taken. Today, this factor is behind us, and Biden felt somewhat freer. Although the freedom to authorize strikes on only a limited number of facilities in the Kursk region is only the first step.
Или не обещания, но твои уже угрозы и не воспринимаются всерьез. Ну и фактор выборов, конечно. Перед выборами, безусловно, любой шаг, который мог бы хоть теоретически им помешать, естественно,
I would like to say that it is symbolic, but in fact it is not a symbolic step, although it is not very far-reaching. Perhaps it is just for the media. For now, they say that we are limiting ourselves to the Kursk region, and we'll see what happens next.
Это всего лишь первый шаг, хочется сказать символически. Нет, не символически, но и не очень далеко идущий.
А возможно, кстати, это просто для СМИ пока так говорят, что только Курской областью ограничиваемся, а там уже посмотрим. Нас смотрят 1500 человек в прямом эфире. Друзья, вы поставьте свой лайк обязательно.
Friends, put your like. It is necessary for YouTube to show this video to more people. Write your comment.
Напишите свой комментарий.
Ukraine plans to launch the first strikes with long-range ATACMS missiles on the Kursk region in the coming days, Reuters reports. Well, we've already talked to you about the Kursk region, but what do you think, and how do you view these strikes? Will they make life a little easier for our defenders, or have the Russians already prepared in principle? Have they protected or relocated all their facilities? They were partially preparing, moving aircraft from airfields within ATACMS range, though I'm unsure if this is still the case. Experience shows that while they managed to destroy key facilities, the preparation for using HIMARS and ATACMS in occupied Ukraine was not particularly effective, lacking a surprise element.
Готовились они, безусловно, но опыт показывает, что и к применению установок HIMARS, и к тех же ATACMS на территории оккупированной территории Украины.
It's impossible to answer without more information. The Kursk region could be disinformation, and the authorization might be broader. As President Zelensky said, the missiles will speak for themselves. If they reach beyond the discussed limits, the authorization is likely wider.
Вы правильно отметили, не знаю, может быть, Курская область это дезинформация, либо чей-то вброс, а на самом деле разрешение носит более широкий характер. Ну, здесь можно процитировать президента Зеленского в том плане, что...
The question is, for this to affect the course of the fighting, yes, even more immediately, a number of factors have to come together. And of course, the importance of the targets that can be hit. For example, if we are talking about cluster-type missiles, with a range of 165 kilometers ATACMS, these missiles are suitable for use on manpower. But on manpower to use, what does that mean? A few missiles could disable a couple of companies, as seen in the Luhansk region. While this won't globally impact the war, it can affect a local area. For example, successfully destroying an S-300 or S-400 system could be significant.
Пару рот, как это было, кстати, на полигонах Луганской области в свое время. Выведение из строя пары рот убитыми и ранеными. Что это глобально, это повлияет на ход боевых действий? Глобально нет, но...
This is a heavy blow. It creates gaps in Russian air defense. It is heavy material damage because such complexes are expensive. Several such strikes have already been successful thanks to ATACMS on S-300, S-400, and it affects a number of circumstances, of course, on the battlefield.
Материальный ущерб, потому что такие комплексы стоят дорого. Несколько таких ударов уже было успешных благодаря атакам по С-300, С-400. И это влияет на ряд обстоятельств, естественно, на поле боя.
For this to have a significant impact, many missiles are needed, including Storm Shadow, for which authorization is still uncertain. The Figaro newspaper retracted its report on these authorizations. Full authorization is required for the full range of Storm Shadow, which is 10 kilometers in its unmodified form.
Должно быть разрешение на всю дальность и желательно на всю дальность Storm Shadow, которая 550.
Naturally, a broader resolution than strikes against purely military targets. In this case, the intimidation effect I'm talking about would work. It's one thing to take the Ukrainian energy sector at a single gate, but it is another thing when suddenly the entire European part of Russia's territory, or part of it, is under attack, including the oil industry, including the energy sector. But there's nothing to say about this, because here we have, there's not even close to a permit. I'm highlighting situations where these authorizations and munitions could be crucial. If Ukraine received large quantities of air-launched JASM missiles with a range of over 300 kilometers, it would significantly impact targeting key objectives. It's important to strike specific high-value targets in small numbers. The question here is what Russia has done to prevent these targets from being set up for the Ukrainians. What was done? It could be anything. Taking the targets out of range. It could be some kind of passive defense. It could be camouflage where it is relevant, for example, airfields. It could be strengthening Russian air defense, which, however, did not cope with the threat of Storm Shadow missiles. And so, as a rule, it didn't. There are both passive and active defensive measures, such as reconnaissance and quick firing cycles. For example, intelligence can track ammo warehouses, and if not urgently unloaded, they remain vulnerable. With aircraft, it's crucial to strike before planes are moved or relocated on airfields.
Нужно успеть, пока самолеты не переместили, пока они не сменили место на аэродроме, не перебазировались. В общем, есть много неизвестных и составляющих.
There are many unknowns, including numbers, intelligence, enemy defense reactions, and the scope of permissions and targets. Currently, the geography and target list appear to be limited. If these restrictions remain, limiting missile use to the Kursk region, it will impact the current situation there. The Russians are on the offensive, but not very successful. Can we stop it altogether, and can we regain territories that have been lost? To stop the offensive, sufficient ground forces are key. Success depends on infantry numbers, quality of tactics, artillery, and less on high-tech weapons like ATACMS. Target designation, reconnaissance, communication, and artillery are crucial. ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and HIMARS munitions are limited, with Ukraine likely using only dozens of these missiles per month. In the Kursk region, only a few ATACs may be used unless targeting something major, like a large ammo depot, which is unlikely. Infantry casualties are more likely from conventional artillery in regular combat.
Я думаю, украинцы могут позволить себе применять их считанные десятки в месяц. Я говорю сейчас вместе ракет. Если, давайте посчитаем, десяток другой ракет, ATACMS, к примеру, можно применить в Курской области. Если это не что-то суперважное, а суперважное это какой-нибудь гигантский склад боеприпасов, которых, скорее всего, там нет, то можно что-то выбивать цели, которые подставляются. Если это кассеты, это пехота.
Destroying anti-aircraft systems in the Kursk region with a limited number of missiles could cause some pain to the enemy, but it won't significantly disrupt the offensive. While some targets may be important, the impact of such strikes would be limited.
Парой-тройкой десятков ракет. Если ты поражаешь не очень важные цели, а в очень важных может просто и не быть, то влияние будет соответствующим. Да, это потери
to the enemy, sometimes even painful, but you do not disrupt the offensive operation in the literal sense of such a roto blow. Although again, the goals can be quite important. For example, if you manage to catch the headquarters of the unit and connection, which is involved in the offensive or just fighting, it naturally knocked out of rhythm this unit. Such was already in the use of HIMARS, when they destroyed the headquarters of the Barigmata died above. Striking the headquarters of units involved in the offensive could disrupt their operations, as seen with HIMARS strikes on command posts. While such strikes cause tactical damage, restrictions on ammunition and limited valuable
но результат на тактическом уровне будет достаточно ограниченный. Если россияне не подставят сильно важных целей,
targets in the Kursk region will result in only a tactical level impact. Will be on a tactical level, will be fairly limited if the Russians don't set up heavily important goals in large numbers. But a lot depends on them too. A lot depends on how many of these missiles there will be, and whether they will be only from the United States, but also from Britain, France, and Germany. Because the French foreign minister said that Paris had not changed its position on strikes with their missiles, but that such a possibility was being considered. But most likely, if America gives us the go-ahead, then European countries should allow us to use these missiles to hit Russia. But I remember that France promised us Mirage airplanes for the beginning of next year.
же полный аналог ракеты Storm Shadow. Ну, кстати, ракета в большей степени французская, чем британская.
French Scalp missiles, equivalent to Storm Shadow, can be launched from Su-24 or Mirage planes. The key advantage of the Mirage is its ability to launch these missiles. The French are delivering the missiles at a pace they deem manageable.
Причем темпы эти не очень велики по двум причинам. Во-первых, запасы этих ракет, дорогостоящих ракет, невелики у самих французов. Во-вторых, производство этих ракет, кроме того, что оно дорогостоящее, оно и достаточно длительное.
The missile supply is limited for two reasons. France has a small stock of expensive missiles, and production takes time. Even with ample funds, a large number of missiles can't be produced quickly. The missiles are likely being transferred separately from the Mirages, which would be useful if F-16 usage faces obstacles due to U.S. policy. Although the aircraft, inferior to the F-16 in almost all parameters, will be important in itself as a fairly modern, by no means super modern, but quite modern Western-type combat aircraft. And, of course, as a carrier of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, it is preferable to the old Su-24s, which, despite their merits, I assume, are literally dying. And the Mirage was literally created for this missile, or rather, it was created for it. Therefore, its use from the Mirage is more effective, and I understand less dangerous for pilots during combat sorties. As far as I understand it, first of all, the French are really ready to hand over the Mirages, since they have stated that they are ready. The issue is the training of Ukrainian personnel. In order to start using them, it is necessary to have a large number of technicians and specialists who ensure the operation of these airplanes on the ground, and trained pilots.
На каком этапе вся вот эта программа именно обучения находится на французскую технику, я, естественно, не знаю.
Of course, I don't know at what stage this entire training program is at in terms of French technology, but on the example of the F-16, and in general, on any examples of training combat pilots and ground personnel, we understand that this is a long process, and if it didn't start quite a while ago, then, accordingly, a lot of time must pass for these aircraft to be used. But I still hope that we are already learning to fly on these airplanes. It is not for nothing that they talk about them. And if we come back to the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles, do you think that these restrictions can only affect the Kursk region? These missiles may all depend on the political decisions of France, the French and British leadership. Their statements are very contradictory. There have already been cases where one could literally conclude from their statements that there is already a direct authorization. But when it says that Ukraine can use the missiles as it sees fit, it looks like an authorization. So if Ukraine has discretion, there you go. And you and I, if I'm not mistaken, have discussed this as well. And I've always maintained that reality will give the answer to whether there is authorization or not. If we see a Storm Shadow missile landing somewhere on Russian territory, we can draw the appropriate conclusions, because no one will use it without authorization. It's unclear if the U.S. can formally restrict the use of components due to treaties. While some components could potentially be restricted, the U.S. has not prohibited their supply to Ukraine.
Американцы могут, значит, эти вот меры принять. Я очень сомневаюсь, что это именно в таком духе. То есть, возможно, есть компоненты, которые американцы могли запретить поставить. Например, запретить поставку зарубежному клиенту, то есть Украине. Но американцы не запретили поставку.
I doubt they have the formal right to prohibit its use. It's more likely that the French and British prefer to follow the U.S. lead as the strongest power, despite contradicting some public statements. Ultimately, practice will reveal the outcome.
Что называется, это, конечно, противоречит несколько их собственным заявлениям публичным, но, видимо, в таком духе все покажет практика.
If we see strikes on targets that are outside the Kursk region or at a very long range, we will understand a great deal, and it will not be difficult to do so. Britain's stockpile of Storm Shadow missiles has dwindled, so these missiles are no longer being supplied to Ukraine, the Times writes, citing its sources. Britain's stockpiles are below a level that the military is willing to go, as a certain amount must be kept to protect national interests. However, I have heard another version that they were not delivered to Ukraine with the intention to send them only when they are authorized to strike the territory of the Russian Federation. David, is there really a shortage of these missiles? And what do we know about the number of ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp? I'll start by saying that there is not a shortage of these missiles. The Americans apparently have thousands of ATACMS missiles, but it is not a huge number. These missiles are very expensive, especially in their modern configuration. Production exists, but it is limited for export. That is, the issue is not just the high cost, but the fact that the production of these missiles is technologically complex, and it is impossible to produce hundreds of missiles a year, if not more. The Americans have obligations to supply these missiles to allies, including urgent and contractual ones. They proceed from two considerations. First, mass use of these missiles by Ukraine could lead to escalation with Russia, which is not good for them. And secondly, the insignificant use of these missiles with geographical and site restrictions will have little effect on the war. This is the paradox in their reasoning. And since that is the case, there is no need to supply a lot of missiles, because no significant effect is expected from them. Regarding Storm Shadow and Scalp situation,
но речь идет о том, что у британцев и у французов запасы, видимо, составляют сотни ракет. Часть этих запасов они поставили украинцам, уже поставили. Производство ограниченное по масштабам.
Apparently even worse.
Ограничено финансово, но ограничено чисто физически тоже.
The British and French likely have hundreds of missiles in stock, some already supplied to Ukraine. Production is limited financially and physically. The delay in supplying missiles until authorization seems odd. If Ukraine needs them to strike Crimea or targets within Ukraine, they should be supplied now, if willing. But if they tell you that you only need the missiles when the Americans give permission, that would be somewhat illogical. It's these reports that are hard to assess 100% whether they're true or not, that there aren't many of them.
То, что первые партии были довольно крупными, но они были довольно крупными по меркам тех запасов, которые есть у британцев и французов.
At first, the shipments were quite large, but by the standards of the stocks that the British and French have and the rate of production, they are still large shipments. At some point, if the missiles are being used up faster than they are being produced, and the stockpiles are dwindling, it is possible that they are holding them back for that reason. The British and French have limited serious tools, especially for warfare against strong opponents, so they must retain some reserve. Not expanding mass production was a prioritization choice. In my view, setting up mass production and contracting large batches of these missiles should have been a priority from the start, both for Ukraine and their own needs. Apparently, this has not been done to an adequate extent. Still, we should realize that the situation is not so simple, and a lot of things are financial. Germany is not yet ready to hand over Taurus missiles to us, but according to bills, Germany will soon begin mass deliveries of kamikaze drones called Mini Taurus to Ukraine.
дронов камикадзе, которые называют мини-таурусами. Речь идет об БПЛА, которые оснащены...
These drones are equipped with artificial intelligence, which gives them high autonomy when working against enemy EMP, and they are being compared to the long-range Taurus missiles that Scholz has so far refused to give us. What do you know about these drones, and can they partially replace these missiles? There is a lot about these drones that I personally do not know, but let's speculate a bit in general terms. Drones that have elements of artificial intelligence are capable of acting autonomously, including recognizing various targets without the involvement of an operator. These drones have a significant advantage because they can be used deep inside enemy territory or in occupied territories when they no longer need to be controlled. This is a very important factor because beyond a certain line, in terms of distance from the front line, the ability to strike begins to be severely limited. This is because either electronic warfare equipment is in the way or the curvature of the ground limits the control range of the equipment, making it impossible to observe or see what is going on. Here, autonomy and the presence of homing heads that, for example, memorize a certain image or target something special allow us to solve problems that would otherwise be much more difficult to solve. It all comes down to tactical and technical characteristics and quantity, range, interference immunity, complexity of the homing heads, their variability, and the opportunities they offer. Of course, quantity is also an important factor. When there are few of them, the result is the same. Even if you destroy a few unimportant targets, it is important to realize that when it comes to Taurus missiles, we are talking about a completely different type of missile. It is a missile that flies hundreds of kilometers and is designed to destroy an important target. Deep inside enemy territory with a powerful warhead. So when we're talking about kamikaze drones with not very long range, that have interesting features, that's different. It all comes down to specific characteristics, as I said, and quantity. The ability to strike targets deep into the front, like artillery or air defense systems, is significant. However, success depends on factors like their invulnerability, functionality, resistance to EW, conventional air defense, quantity, and explosive power.
Все это очень важно. Именно совокупность вот этих факторов позволяет делать выводы.
All these factors are crucial for drawing conclusions. However, it would be wrong to say this can replace the Taurus. The Taurus is for a specific purpose, and despite Germany supplying Ukraine with many important items, Scholz firmly refuses to provide the Taurus, with no prospects for it at the moment. Unless Scholz drastically changes his policy, it is important to realize that even if he decided to supply Tauruses, these are missiles close in characteristics to Storm Shadow and Scalp, and the Germans certainly could not supply them in large numbers, as the stockpile is very small. It would add, conditionally, a few dozen missiles for a few months, which would also be a lot, but, as we see, this is just a fantasy. Because Scholz refuses to do that in this case, and Taurus missiles can penetrate Putin's bunker, maybe that's why he refuses. It's laughable, but actually one of the reasons, and we know this from behind-the-scenes sources, at least those that are not shy about voicing it, is the fear that the Ukrainians could strike somewhere that would cause particular irritation in Russia, including Moscow, because of the reach. Either way, they fear escalation. Storm Shadow missiles are also perfectly capable of penetrating certain bunkers. But, of course, there are bunkers that are much more defensible that are inaccessible to such missiles. But again, in all seriousness, the fear of escalation with Russia is what drives Scholz in everything that concerns the non-transfer of Tauruses. And here he seems adamant, at least judging by all his statements that have been made in public. David, thank you so much for this conversation, for taking the time for our broadcast. I wish you a good, restful day. Just a reminder that David Sharp has been on the air with us. Friends, be sure to like, comment, tell us what you think about the authorization to strike of the Russian Federation, where you would like the missiles to go. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you all for your attention. Take care. See you all later. Anastasia, all the best. Have a good day.
Всего наилучшего и спокойного дня.